So first, we are not going to be meeting in this room on Thursday, right? We're going to come to 210 down the hall. It's the computer lab. You'll recognize it because it's the room that's full of computers. And we're going to be working there. So you don't have to wait till Thursday to start on your draft. If you have a paper idea you want to get going, I encourage you to actually get started earlier. But you will have the opportunity to work on it like under my supervision and with, potential for immediate feedback, right? If you do have something before Thursday that you want me to look at, I am also happy to do that for you, right? Just come to my office or shoot me an email, and yeah, I'm happy to look over whatever you got. The draft is due Thursday night at midnight, and I just want to remind everybody that it's going to be graded based on completion rather than quality, right? As long as you get me a fair attempt at this that is at least 750 words long, you'll get full credit for it. If you give me less than 750 words, you'll still get credit, it just won't be as much, right? Now, this means that I do want to see, 3/4 of a finished essay here, right? Not 1 page of analysis and then 2 pages or so of like the same paragraph repeated over and over again, or of gibberish, or of, Dr. Moyer is such an asshole, I bet he doesn't even read this, right? I will be reading it, and I will be giving you feedback, right? But like I said, I won't be grading you on the quality of it yet. That's going to be for the final paper. So does anybody have any questions about the paper or about the draft? No? We're good? Everybody clear? Everybody can do this? Yes? So then what you're going to do for next Tuesday, there are actually going to be, provided everybody shows up, there are going to be 9 of us on Tuesday, because I'm going to be combining this section with my other section for the reacting to the past game, in large part because that's just a lot easier to do with 9 people than it is with 7 or with 2. They'll be joining us starting on Tuesday for peer review, so you'll need to bring to class with you 2 copies of your draft, right? Now, the last thing that I wanted to just cover with you quickly before we get back into Rousseau, how many of you have done Mla Style Citation before for a paper? Okay, everybody has. Good. So I just want to quickly review that to make sure that everybody gets this right and knows what they're doing, right? And I know like this is not exciting stuff, but like while I won't fail you for getting it wrong if you make a decent attempt at it, I have some colleagues who will. So just for your future protection, I just want to make sure everybody understands this, right? So how do you do a citation in text, MLA style? Like in the body of the paper, if you're citing, if you're providing a citation for a quote or a paraphrase of something, how do you do that?
Author's name and page number in parentheses.
Yep, author's name and page number in parentheses before the period, right? So say you're quoting from Rousseau, page 74, right? All you got to give me is that. Right? Simple. Yeah, go ahead, Caroline.
There's no comma in between.
There is no comma in between.
Okay.
Nope. Nope. Just author's last name, page number. Yep. Now, when you are doing the works cited page, you're only going to be citing one work, right? You're only writing about Voltaire or Rousseau. But let me give you the basic structure so that everybody knows how to do this. And by the way, I know that MS Word and Google Docs do have like an automatic citation function. Don't use that because it always gets it wrong. So the basic format of this is author last name, first name. The title underlined or italicized. If it has an editor or translator, provide that person's name here. Then you want the location of publication, the publisher, and the date. So if you're citing this edition of Rousseau, right, it's going to look like this, right? Rousseau, Jean-Jacques, on the social contract, translated by G.D.H. Cole, Garden City, New York, Dover, 2003. Right. It's actually pretty easy to do a citation for just a single author book, right? Even if it does have, you know, an editor or a translator. Things get a little bit more complicated when you have to deal with things like works that are in an anthology or that sort of thing, but we don't have to worry about that yet. Now, if you do have questions about citation or want to make sure that you're doing it correctly, you can always check your work with the Purdue Online Writing Lab. Just type into Google Purdue OWL MLA citation, and it'll take you to a page where it gives you all of the basic formats and a whole bunch of examples, right? So you can make sure you're doing it correctly. So does anybody have any questions about citation? All right, good, great. So let's jump back into Rousseau then. What'd y'all write about today?
The inflexibility of laws.
Okay. So what quote did you start with?
I used, it was from page 85.
Okay.
The inflexibility of the laws which prevents them from adapting themselves to circumstances may in certain cases render them disastrous and may bring about at a time of crisis the ruin of the state.
Okay. So what did you have? Why did you pick that quote? What's that?
I don't know. I read it and was like, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Like, comparing it to time now, like it says there's like inflexibility, like in the time, like with the social contract, but like I feel like now, like there's loopholes and like there's always going to be an exception to something.
Okay. So let's try and compare that then to some of Rousseau's ideas, right? So what would Rousseau say if a society's laws had a bunch of loopholes and exceptions? What would he think of those laws? And why?
You would think they weren't worth much.
Yeah. He would not be in favor of such laws, right? Why would they not be worth much? Like, what's wrong for him with laws that have loopholes and exceptions? What does that suggest about them?
Could you define a law as a limitation of sorts? So if you could bring a limitation, that was the point of law.
Okay. So where does the problem in that kind of law come in? Does it come in with later interpretation, or does it start with design? Well, and try to think from Rousseau's perspective. I think that there's actually a definite, clear answer if we're trying to think like Rousseau. If the law doesn't apply equally to everybody, is the problem in the way we're interpreting it or the way the law was written?
I would say the way it was written.
Yeah, it's a problem of design, right? If there's a law that doesn't apply equally to everybody in every social class at all times, right? Then what is that law not expressing? What is it not an expression of?
Equality.
What does Rousseau think is the source of all good laws? Where do they come from? He has a specific term for this.
General will.
The general will, yes, exactly. I like that in stereo. Yeah. So a law that has all kinds of exceptions and loopholes carved out is not an expression of the general will, or not a genuine expression of the general will, right? So the inflexibility of the laws for Rousseau, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does he think laws should be inflexible? Yeah. If it's a good law, right? If it's a well-written law, a well-designed law, then it ought to be unbreakable, right? And it shouldn't have a lot of exceptions. Shouldn't have any exceptions. So, at what point in its development does Rousseau seem to think a society needs to institute good laws? Let me put it to you another way. Does he seem to think that you can reform a bad system by reforming the law? The rot's already set in, right? So where do you need to go? Where do you need to start instituting good laws? At what point in your society's development?
Beginning.
Right at the beginning, yeah, exactly. And if your society has reached a point where the laws are not good, right, and the laws are no longer in accordance with the general will, you can't bring them back in line with reform. You have to scrap it and start over, right? You need a new beginning with new laws. Because a society is shaped by that kind of foundation of laws that dictate human behavior, right? And that are supposed to protect our natural and civil rights and bring those in line with each other, right? Does this make sense? You have doubts?
Not really, I'm just trying to figure it out.
Okay.
Listen.
Because yeah, I know there's probably a lot in Rousseau that doesn't necessarily go down easy, right? And I'm sure that there are, I'm not in 100% agreement personally with everything Rousseau says, and I don't expect any of you to be either. So if there are like, maybe that's actually like, were there things in this last part that you found uncomfortable or troubling? Or maybe even just baffling.
shot at Christians was interesting.
Okay, what do you mean shot at?
He was talking about as far as like a Christian army.
Uh-huh.
He said they'd be basically ineffective if they are truly Christian.
Okay, and what's his logic there? Let's go to that passage. So, if we look on page 94, I think is maybe where some of this starts. He says, we are told that a people of true Christians would form the most perfect society imaginable. I see in this supposition only one great difficulty, that a society of true Christians would not be a society of men. I say further that such a society, with all its perfection, would be neither the strongest nor the most lasting. The very fact that it was perfect would rob it of its bond of union. The flaw that would destroy it would lie in its very perfection. Everyone would do his duty, the people would be law-abiding, the rulers just and temperate, the magistrates upright and incorruptible, the soldiers would scorn death, there would be neither vanity nor luxury. So far, so good, but let us hear more. So, let's just kind of pause here for a second and think about why he thinks a society that he describes as being in most ways perfection is not a human society.
Because humans aren't perfect.
Okay, humans are by definition not perfect, right? And I think this might be one of the points where Rousseau comes into closest contact with Voltaire, right? Maybe by the end of class I want to try to compare the two a little bit, but generally speaking, these two guys didn't like each other and didn't agree with each other. But how did Voltaire end Candide? What was that kind of last injunction that he gave to the reader? Does anybody remember what Candide said to Pangloss in that last sentence?
We must tend to our gardens, or
Yeah, about cultivating our garden, right? We must cultivate our garden. So, a good society, the maintenance of a good society requires work and cooperation, right? That human beings have to be able to, debate and discuss and decide on things amongst themselves in order for a society to work. So a society in which everything is already perfect and everyone's already in agreement, think like El Dorado in Candide, right? Is one that doesn't feel fully human. And the other point to this is kind of what he says in the next paragraph, that Christianity as a religion is entirely spiritual, occupied with heavenly things. The country of the Christian is not of this world. So how does this, in Rousseau's thinking, affect the administration of a state, right? If you are most focused on what's going to happen to you in the next life, do you care that much about what happens to you in this life? And do things like the state of your country actually make much difference in the grand scheme of things? Not so, at least according to Rousseau's argument here, right? I am not trying to make any kind of blanket statements about Christians or about Christianity, right? We're just trying to follow the reasoning. Right? He does his duty indeed, but does it with profound indifference to the good or ill success of his cares. Provided he has nothing to reproach himself with, it matters little to him whether things go well or ill here on earth. If the state is prosperous, he he hardly dares to share in the public happiness, for fear he may grow proud of his country's glory. If the state is languishing, he blesses the hand of God that is hard upon his people. So, we might want to situate this in both the broader historical context and also in Rousseau's kind of general attitude towards the relationship between religion and the state, right? So if we back this up a page, right, he describes three different possible relationships between religion and the state. So, can I get somebody to read for us the paragraph that starts at the top of the page with religion considered in relation to society? 93. What's that? Anybody? Yeah, okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Religion considered to be in relation to society, whether it is either general or particular, may also be divided into two kinds: the religion of man and that of the citizen. First, which has neither temples nor altars nor rites, and is confined to the purely internal cult of the supreme God and the eternal obligations of morality, is the religion of the gospel pure and simple, the true theism, what may be called natural divine right or law.
Okay, let's pause there for a second at this, what he calls the religion of man, right? What does this religion look like to us? What seems to be its aim and what is it missing? Has neither temples nor altars nor rites. If it has neither temples nor altars nor rites, what else must it not have? Okay, yeah, no idols, sure. But who administers those temples and those altars and those rites?
Ministers.
Yeah, or priests, right? So what this religion doesn't have is any special priestly caste, right? Or, priestly category in society that is specifically responsible for religious rites, right? Again, particularly important given the mid-18th century context. We'll get to why in a moment. Now, can you continue reading for us, please, Ethan, with the other?
The other, which is codified in a single country, is its gods, its own tutelary patrons. It has its own dogmas, its rights, and its external cult prescribed by law. Outside the single nation that follows it, all the world is in its sight infidel, foreign, and barbarous. The duties and rights of man extend forth only as far as its own altars. Of this kind were all the religions of early peoples, which we may define as civil or positive divine right or law.
Okay, thank you. So, how is this second category of religion different? This, citizen religion or civic religion? So this natural religion he describes in the first part is not organized, right, in any particular way. It seems to have more to do with kind of like a personal connection with some spiritual force, right? Yes, use the force. What about this second type?
Kind of reminds me of like he's trying to describe the height of Catholic power kind of society.
Actually, that's what he's kind of describing as the third type. So we'll get to that in a minute. What this second type looks more like is, I don't know, how familiar are y'all with with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Bible? Passing a little bit? Okay. So at various points, the God of Israel is described as the God of Israel, right? As the God of this particular nation. And over in Phoenicia, you have Baal. And over in Ammon, you have Milcom, and you have Kaus in Edom, and Chemosh in Moab, right? And each of these nations has their specific god who was only worshipped by that nation, right? The Babylonian Marduk is another example of this, right? And he's not so much a god of any particular force or thing, right? He's the god of that nation who was only worshipped by these people, and his religion is part of the whole engine of the state, right? So we have here a kind of total union of church and state. You might think of like the imperial cult in Rome the same way, right? Where people were citizens of the empire could basically follow whatever religion they wanted as long as they also acknowledged the emperor as a god, right? And that was going to be one of the sticking points in the province of Judea. The people were monotheistic, and you're like, well, no, like we don't worship any god but this god, so we can't worship the emperor. But yeah, the whole idea there, right, was that the emperor was to be worshipped as a god, and his religion, his cult, was wrapped up in the state, right? So yeah, this is a state religion. Right, totally wrapped up in civic life. Now, when we get to this third category, there is a third sort of religion of a more singular kind, which gives men two codes of legislation, two rulers, and two countries, renders them subject to contradictory duties, and makes it impossible for them to be faithful both to religion and to citizenship. Such are the religions of the Lamas and of the Japanese, and such is Roman Christianity, which may be called the religion of the priest. It leads to a sort of mixed and antisocial code which has no name. Right, so he gives this no name. But what does he think is wrong with this kind of system? If you have churches that are independent of the state.
They contradict each other.
Yeah, exactly. The state and the church are separate authority structures, right? Separate sovereignty bodies that don't necessarily agree with each other. So if you are, say, if you're, according to Rousseau's logic again, right? If you are an American Catholic, you're basically a subject of two countries, right? Of the United States and also of the Roman Church. As such, unless those two bodies are in perfect agreement, you cannot follow the dictates of both. So then what does this disrupt? What does this break up in a country?
The general will.
Yes, this is a violation of the general will, right? So we tend to regard, for historical reasons particularly, separation of church and state as a positive thing, right? It's guaranteed in our Constitution. And this is largely due to the fact that because, England had a state church, even people who did not belong to the Church of England had to pay taxes to support it. And people who belonged to other faiths were not allowed representation in Parliament. They weren't allowed to take seats in Parliament, right? So, we removed the idea of any religious test for office and the idea that the state should support any particular religion. So, Rousseau seems to think this is actually a bad idea, right? That if you are going to have a functioning state, then the state religion should be part of that whole machinery, right? That these two things should actually be united. So this is one place where Rousseau's ideas kind of deviate from where we ended up in practice, right? So even though I think we can see a lot of similarities between our form of government and the kinds of things Rousseau proposes, there are definitely certain things that we did not adopt, right? So, we do also have to consider Rousseau's position in its context, right? So do we remember politically what French society looked like in 1768 when he published this? Or 1762 when he published this? I mean, not that that makes much difference, but...
Aristocratic.
Okay, aristocratic, right? Do we remember the three estates theory? Who were the first and second estates?
Leaders of the church.
Yep, first estate was the church. The second was the nobility. And the third was everyone else, right? From, your wealthy, educated lawyer to your average turnip farmer, right? All part of the third estate. So Rousseau sees the church and its kind of separate authority structure as a kind of wedge between the nobility and everyone else, right? Between the second and third estates. And thus a force that divides and splits, the general will, right? So, does this clarify some of Rousseau's views on religion for y'all? And remember too that like while he's not necessarily taking shots at Christianity, which he seems to regard as a good moral system, right? But he thinks it's a lousy basis on which to found a state because it's not concerned with worldly things, right? And as such, not a great not a great way for administering law in this world, right? Since its concerns are next worldly. Are there other things that y'all wanted to discuss or ask about? What did the rest of you write about?
I wrote about the censorship.
Okay. And what did you write about censorship?
The first paragraph.
Okay.
About the declaration of the general will, the censorship is the declaration of the public judgment.
Okay. Public opinion is the form of law which the censor administers, and like the prince, only applies to particular cases. Okay, cool. So let's try to unpack this a little bit, right? When we think of someone as when we think of a censor, what does this make us think of? Like, what does the word censor mean to us?
To disallow the viewing of.
Okay, yeah, we think of a censor as someone who, like, sits and watches a TV show or a movie, right? And says, no, we got to cut this, we got to cut this, we got to cut this, right? Or who reads a book or a magazine article and says, no, this has to be cut, this has to be cut, right? Before it can be given to the public, right? So, is the typical American view of censorship a positive or a negative thing? Generally, we, at least when we use the word, we use it as pejorative, right? It's like you're trying to censor me, right? You're trying to shut me up or limit my personal expression, right? Does Rousseau seem to see censorship as a negative thing? Let's take another look at this first paragraph in this section on page 88, right? As the law is the declaration of the general will, the censorship is the declaration of the public judgment. Public opinion is the form of law which the censor administers, and like the prince, only applies to particular cases. So does he regard the censor as a kind of separate authority figure who's limiting what you can and can't say? The censorial tribunal, so far from being the arbiter of the people's opinion, only declares it. And, as soon as the two-part company, its decisions are null and void. So what does he think the censor is expressing?
General will.
What's that?
General will.
Yeah, the censor is expressing the general will, right? Can't go against the general will. And how is the censor empowered to enforce the general will? What do the censor's decisions have to be based on? On a personal moral code?
General will code.
Yeah, basically the moral code that's shared across society, right? So the censor acts in accordance with public opinion, right? According to Rousseau, right? So public opinion considers this out of bounds. Therefore, we will not allow this expression, right? And we actually do see this work out in practice, right? So while we may not have, government censorship of, of publications or films or the internet or that sort of thing, right? Private organizations and private citizens often do make determinations that certain ideas are out of bounds, right? For example, you typically won't find, a major U.S. newspaper, publishing an opinion piece that is avowedly white supremacist, right? You typically won't find any, major U.S. publication, advocating for mass sterilization of any particular group of people, right? Certain ideas are considered beyond the pale, outside of the mainstream of public opinion, and so don't make it into public discourse. So, this is more the kind of thing Rousseau is thinking about, right? That the sorts of things that the censor allows and disallows have to be in line with public opinion and with the way the public perceives what is and isn't moral. And, maybe one of the reasons we have so many fights about this, we're having all these fights now about book banning, right, is that we don't have a public that is in unified agreement on what is and is not moral, right? So these kinds of things only work out if there is, as Rousseau would put it, a general will motivating the kinds of decisions that are made, right? And what is the thing that Rousseau always opposes to general will? What's the opposite of general will?
Personal.
There's a phrase he uses. It sounds a little like personal. Let's go to page 74 for a second, and this might help us, right? Apart from this primitive contract, the vote of the majority always binds all the rest. This follows from the contract itself. But it is asked how a man can be both free and forced to conform to wills that are not his own. How are the opponents at once free and subject to laws they have not agreed to? I retort that the question is wrongly put. The citizen gives his consent to all the laws, including those which are passed in spite of his opposition, and even those which punish him when he dares to break any of them. The constant will of all the members of the state is the general will. By virtue of it, they are citizens and free. When in the popular assembly a law is proposed, what the people is asked is not exactly whether it approves or rejects the proposal, but whether it is in conformity with the general will, which is their will. Each man, in giving his vote, states his opinion on that point, and the general will is found by counting votes. When, therefore, the opinion that is contrary to my own prevails, this proves neither more or less than that I was mistaken, and that what I thought to be the general will was not so. If my particular opinion had carried the day, I should have achieved the opposite of what was my will, and as in that case, I should not have been free. So this is a little confusing, right? But there are a couple of basic premises in here that I think are important for understanding what Rousseau is arguing. First off, can the general will ever be wrong? General will is always right, right? And how do we find the general will? How do we figure out what the general will is? What do we do to determine the general will? We vote, yeah. And we count up the votes, right? And whichever proposal got the most votes is the one that is in accordance with the general will, right? So, what is he saying happens in cases where my vote, for example, and I know this from long-lived experience, like I've voted for losing candidates and proposals more often than I voted for winners, right? If my opinion loses, who's wrong? And what are they wrong about? The general will can't be wrong, right? So, if somebody's wrong, it must be me. And I misinterpreted the general will, right? When I made my vote. So what must my vote have been based on, if not the general will? He actually says it right here near the end of the paragraph. The opposite of for Rousseau of the general will is always particular interest or opinion, right? If I voted the wrong way, it means that I mistook my particular interest, right? The thing that is good for me with the general will, that is the thing that is good for everybody, right? So I'm the one that's in the wrong. Yeah, go ahead.
If everyone's particular interest is the same, wouldn't that make it general will?
Well, yeah, if everybody's interest is the same, but yeah, then there is no particular interest because everyone's interest is the same, right? So that would be the general will. But the likelihood is that unless you are living in a society in which everyone is essentially equal in all respects, right? Everyone is going to have a different particular interest, right? Certain factions might have their particular interest, right? So, for example, maybe like, you live in a state where one of the primary the primary industries is shipbuilding, right? In that case, you want to be able to get cheap steel from anywhere so that it costs you less to build a ship, right? Now then, that puts you in opposition with, say, states that make steel and that want you to buy their steel and don't want cheap foreign competition, right? This actually is something that happened about 20 years ago. It was a dispute between Louisiana and my home state of Pennsylvania, right? That Louisiana wanted tariffs on steel imports dropped so they could make ships more cheaply. And Pennsylvania did not want this to happen because a major industry there is making steel. So they didn't want foreign competition. So in that case, you've got two factions, right, with different particular interests. And in order to determine the general will, you would have to take a vote and see what the majority thinks, right? And the majority choice is the expression of the general will, right? That's the common good, that's the thing that's good for everybody, and not just these two disputants, right? Does this make sense? So yeah, that's how things are more likely to work out in practice, right? Particularly if you're living in a very large country with, with different interests in different regions, right? You're going to have these kinds of arguments, you're going to have these kinds of fights. And the general will for Rousseau is always expressed through majority opinion. Now, we do see that this, can we see where this could lead to abuse or to a problem? If Rousseau thinks the majority is always right. And that the general will always tends towards the common good. are there implications of that that might be a little bit troubling? In the case of something like a fight over steel tariffs between states, probably not so much, right? But can you imagine other instances where a majority might trample on the rights of a minority?
Religious rights.
Okay, religious rights might be one case in point, right? Yeah, even like there doesn't seem to be much protection in Rousseau's system, right? For people who vote against what the general will is, right? For people who are in the minority of some particular matter of opinion. So there seems like basically what he tells you is that, well, if you voted against the majority, then you clearly misunderstood what the general will was. And yeah, there doesn't seem to be much protection there for anyone who dissents, right? Even this whole idea of censorship, right? That censorship is based on a sense of public morality and what the public will or will not allow. That's what the censor is empowered to enforce. There seems to be. Does there seem to you, before I give you too leading a response there, does there seem to you to be a big difference here between the way Voltaire might think about this and the way Rousseau does? Even if we're just thinking about this idea of expression, right? That kind of Macon brought us to by mentioning the stuff about censorship, right? What did Voltaire tend to think about free expression?
It was good.
Yeah, free expression is always good, right? Right, no matter what you're trying to express. I don't know, have any of you ever heard the phrase, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it? Yeah, that's often attributed to Voltaire. But yeah, Voltaire believes that you should be able to express any opinion you want, even if it's dumb or odious in some way, right? That it's worse to suppress opinion, to suppress expression, than it is to simply allow it. Now, what does Rousseau seem to think about free expression?
As long as it follows the general will, let it go.
Yeah, that all expression must follow the general will, right?
What are Rousseau's beliefs on the evolution of the general will? Like how does he think it could change? Because if it's everyone thinks the same thing at the same time, generally, then changing that would require a lot of effort.
Well, and I think that Rousseau would say that it's not that the general will itself, like as an entity, as a quantity, doesn't change. But the people who make up the general will do. So, yeah, as a society evolves, then the general will that we constitute, right, might make different decisions than the general will that our grandparents or great-grandparents constituted. So the people change. The general will really doesn't. Right? It's always the same thing, even if it's declaring something else, right? The general will is always kind of like the average of all of the individual wills of the people. But again, as as we get scientific progress and generational change, then yeah, that average shifts, right? Like even if we look at our contemporary politics, do y'all know what the Overton window is? Have you ever heard this term before? Okay, so the Overton window, and this is not Rousseau, this is not a concept you would be familiar with, but the Overton window is the spectrum of what's considered acceptable debate within any given society. And for a long time in the United States, for most of my lifetime, really, the Overton window was pretty narrow, right? We have two political parties, and both of them were committed to some form of free market capitalism and to a basically neoconservative foreign policy about promoting democracy abroad, right? They were both into these things to different degrees, but that was basically the limit of acceptable debate, right? Now, over maybe just the last 7 or 8 years, we've seen the Overton window in the U.S. shift, both to the left and to the right? And ideas on both sides of that spectrum that would have been considered beyond the pale, even by my parents 20 years ago, are now open for debate, right? So whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave you to think about. Right? It's just an example of how generational change and other kind of social impacts in a society do affect the nature of the general will. Okay, so we're about at time. I know that it's midterm and you are all very tired, and this is not easy stuff to wrap your brain around, especially on a Tuesday afternoon when you had a bio exam in the morning. I think that others of you have math and bio exams tomorrow, right? So good luck on all of that. May the general will empower you to a good grade. So we'll see you on Thursday in the computer lab, right?